Hello everyone, it's Daniel, Modern Identity Lead from Formula 5. In this video, we are going to talk about BambooHR integration with Microsoft Entra ID. BambooHR is human resources system and Microsoft Entra ID is an identity provider broadly used by many organizations. Okay, so let's start with BambooHR. It's human resources software. Complete HR platform that brings all employee, payroll, time and benefit information together in one place. An important fact is that we use it at Formula 5. So now the question is, what did we want to accomplish here? So important fact is that we store all employee data in BambooHR. So in this specific scenario, we store everything about employees, like first name, last name, their addresses, job titles, emails, and all the data related to them. So it's very important to mention that we do not store all this information in Microsoft Entra ID. We have like a separate system for that, which is BambooHR. However, as in many organizations, we also have Microsoft Entra ID, which is identity provider, and we use it to secure access to many corporate resources. So now the goal was, in this solution, to automatically provision user accounts, employee accounts in Microsoft Entra ID once those accounts are added in BambooHR system. So for that, we obviously used some attribute called hire date, which I will show you. But important fact is that once the employee is added in BambooHR, we want to automatically provision user account in Microsoft Entra ID. And also, we would like to send welcome email to such user and grant access to specific resources, including Microsoft channels, Microsoft Teams channels to be more specific. So in this case, we decided to use Microsoft Entra ID inbound provisioning API and Microsoft Entra ID governance lifecycle workflows. And this is what I will show you in this video. So again, when it comes to products, there are many Microsoft Entra products. In this specific video, we are focusing on two: Microsoft Entra ID, obviously, identity provider, and Microsoft Entra ID governance, which we used for automating different things related to user accounts. Okay, perfect. So let's start with inbound provisioning API. Microsoft Entra ID offers inbound provisioning API. Inbound provisioning API enables connecting Microsoft Entra ID tenant to authoritative systems of record for inbound identity provisioning. ID administrators retain control on identity data flow, transformations, and mappings. And for us, it's important to know that we can basically extract information about users from different kinds of sources and import this data to Microsoft Entra ID using Microsoft Entra provisioning service. So as you can see, the sources, there are many different sources basically. This can be SQL database, CSV files, some, like other solutions from HR vendors. It can be custom application. It can be almost everything, because the case is that Microsoft Entra provisioning service provides this endpoint, provisioning API endpoint that we can connect to, and we can push the data about our employees, users, and in the end, their accounts will be automatically created in Microsoft Entra ID. And obviously, we have this possibility to map specific attributes. That's very important, and this is about the administration here. So we have the possibility to map specific attributes from, let's say, BambooHR system to attributes that will be used in the user profile in Microsoft Entra ID. Okay, perfect. So in this specific scenario, we did not only use inbound provisioning API, but also we used identity governance and administration here, and lifecycle workflows to be more specific. So as you probably know, in Microsoft Entra ID governance, there are different kinds of things we can do. So we can control identity lifecycle, so what is happening with the user account For instance, when user is changing, like department, the job role, or leaving our organization. There is also access lifecycle to which resources user has access to in different roles, or like maybe sometimes we want to just grant access to only specific resources under a specific job role. And obviously privilege access lifecycle. It's more about the roles assigned in Microsoft Entra ID and potentially Azure subscriptions. So in this case, we can control those roles and we can assign them. In this specific video and this specific solution, we mostly focus on identity lifecycle capabilities. So we wanted to automatically update user information in Microsoft Entra ID using the data from BambooHR. But obviously, we can update this data also in on-premises Active Directory, but at Formula 5, we purely use Microsoft Entra ID, which is the cloud service. And also, we use lifecycle workflows to automate workflow tasks that run at certain key events. So, for example, a workflow can be configured to send unwelcome email to the user on their first day. And this is what we did at Formula 5 basically, because we wanted to import or provision user accounts from BambooHR system and create those accounts in Microsoft Entra. And then we wanted to send welcome emails to those users and also grant access to specific resources to those users, including Microsoft Teams channels. If you would like to learn more about Microsoft Entra ID governance specifically, I recommend watching my other video available on our channel. Perfect. So that's about the theory, that's about the goals. And right now it's time to see it in practice. Here is the development instance of BambooHR we use at Formula 5. Obviously, I cannot present production instance because we have employee record there. But I will show all the steps we did for the production solution. So in BambooHR, obviously, we can add new employees. So under people, we can add new employee using new employee button. We have to provide first name, last name, address, all the information that is required for our employees. And there is also the attribute called hire date. So if I open Charlotte, for instance, this is one of the employees here, we can see that there is this hire date attribute. And it's very important because we strongly depend on this hire date attribute in our solution, which I will explain later. So once we create an account for employee here in BambooHR, we want to also create account or user account, to be more specific, in Microsoft Entra ID. So for this, we used Microsoft Entra Inbound Provisioning API. Before I will jump into Microsoft Entra Admin Center and Azure Portal to show you the components we created and developed, important information is that BambooHR provides API. So here I can generate API key and then I can access BambooHR API. So in this specific scenario, I can, for instance, get information about all new employees. Okay, so this is very important, that using the API, I can ask BambooHR for all new employees. And also it's very helpful because I can also ask for all the employees where some attributes were changed. That's really powerful. So in our solution, we use BambooHR API to get information about new employees. And this information obviously can be returned in JSON format. So then we can look into this information and use it with Microsoft Entra Inbound Provisioning API. So now let me jump into Microsoft Azure Portal and Entra Admin Center to show you other components of this solution. Okay, so first of all, it's important to create service principal for provisioning enterprise application in Microsoft Entra ID. This is what you will find in Microsoft documentation. Without this enterprise application register, you will not be able to use inbound provisioning API. So I've registered this service principal, and as you can see, the enterprise application is called BambooHR Data Provisioning to Microsoft Entra ID. Important information is that I had to configure attribute mappings to make sure that attributes in data from BambooHR API will map to attributes needed by Microsoft Entra Inbound Provisioning API to provision user accounts. So under Edit Attribute Mappings and under Mappings section here, I created those mappings for user accounts. As you can see, there are multiple mappings, and the important fact is that in this column we have Microsoft Entra ID attributes, and in the API attribute column we have attributes from BambooHR API. So for instance, the property external ID from BambooHR API will be mapped to employee ID attribute in Microsoft Entra ID. And as you can see, I map all other required attributes, including the hire date and department. And hire date is crucial here, because as you can see, hire date is mapped to employee hire date in Microsoft Entra ID, which will be then used in the lifecycle workflows in Microsoft Entra ID governance to send information to the users like welcome emails, to add them to the specific Microsoft Teams channels, and so on and so forth. So this mapping is very important here. Without the proper mapping of the attributes, user accounts will not be provisioned successfully in Microsoft Entra ID. Okay, perfect. So now let me jump into Azure portal. There are a couple of services we had to configure and implement to successfully provision those users' accounts in Microsoft Entra ID from BambooHR. So first of all, we used Azure Logic App, as you can see. And this Azure Logic App is responsible for calling BambooHR API and extracting information about all the changes to user accounts or employee accounts, and also information about new hires. So that's very important. So we use this Logic App. It has a time trigger. It runs multiple times per day to make sure that we have fresh data in Microsoft Entra ID. There is also Azure Key Vault, where we store API key for BambooHR API. And we also have Azure Function. And this Azure Function is responsible for data transformations. So basically, we extract pure JSON data from BambooHR API, but then inbound provisioning API on the Microsoft Entra side requires SIM format. So system for cross-domain identity, basically. So in this case, we cannot just push the data from BambooHR API directly to inbound provisioning API. We have to do some transformations on this data to prepare it to be in the right SIM format, and then we can send this data to inbound provisioning API. Okay, so let's look at the Azure Logic App we prepared. So as I mentioned before, this Logic App is triggered a few times per day. So we have this recurrence step here. And once it's triggered, the API key for BambooHR API is extracted from Azure Key Vault. We call BambooHR to get information about the employees and about the changes in their accounts. We initialize employee data report, and also we do some data transformations here, and we set a few arrays here. Important fact is that we don't want to push all the employees from BambooHR to Formula 5 Microsoft Entra ID. So we have this condition here. If employee history status contains F5 benefits, F5 hourly, or F5 benefits US, then we want to push those accounts to Microsoft Entra ID. So in the end, we prepare the JSON data, and in the end, we call data transformation function up. So in this step, we do not call inbound provisioning API yet. We call Azure Function to pass the information and data about the employees to Azure Function. And then Azure Function will apply transformations, will prepare SIM data format, and then this information will be sent to Microsoft Entra Inbound Provisioning API. Here is the fragment of the source code for this Azure function. Important fact is that once the data is prepared by Azure Logic App, this function is called basically from the Azure Logic App. And this function is purely responsible for data transformation. So as you can see here, there is SIEM user data prepared. So we extract employee data sent by Azure Logic App. We prepare SIEM user data for inbound provisioning API. And obviously, before we can call the API, we have to obtain the access token. So in this case, if we work on the local host, we use client ID, client secret, and tenant ID to obtain the access token. But when the application is deployed to the Azure cloud, we use system assigned managed identity. So we granted access, we granted permissions, to be more precise, to Azure function managed identity to obtain access token to call inbound provisioning API. So once we obtain the access token, we can successfully call inbound provisioning API with the SIEM user data here. Okay, perfect. So now let me show you this whole integration in action. Let's start in BambooHR. Let's say that today we hire 2 new employees at Formula 5, Charlotte and Eric. So under hire date, we have the current date for both Eric and Charlotte. So right now, when Azure Logic App will be triggered, we should have automatically created accounts in Microsoft Entra ID for those employees. So let's look at the Azure Logic App now. Just for the demo purpose, I will trigger this Azure Logic App manually. In a standard way, this Azure Logic App is triggered multiple times per day. So I will click Run. And now I will open Run History tab and we will see the status here. So let's wait a couple of seconds. Let me refresh this. And as we can see, the last execution succeeded. So now let's open this tab. And here let's see the execution details and what happened in each step. So as we can see, Azure Logic App was triggered. The secret was taken from the Azure Key Vault, so the API key for BambooHR. We called BambooHR API to get information about the employees. And now, obviously, we applied some transformations on the employee array. And now what we can see here, we, in the last step, call Azure Function App. So here in the body, we can see that there is employee data here. So we have information about Eric here, as you can see. And also we have information about Charlotte. An important fact is that also we have hire date. So it's the current date here for both Eric and Charlotte. And also there is work email. So this is obviously like a temporary email here for demo purposes, but in the reality, this is Formula 5 email. And we have also the job title. Perfect. So now let's jump into Microsoft Entra Admin Center to see whether those accounts were successfully provisioned. When I filter employees by employee hire date attribute, we can see that Charlotte and Eric accounts were successfully created in Microsoft Entra ID using inbound provisioning API. When I click on Charlotte, let's say, let's look at the profile attributes to make sure that all the required attributes were filled out successfully. So when I click Properties, we can see that there is information about Charlotte, first name, last name. There is also information about the department and the job title. And this information is taken from BambooHR. Perfect. So once the account is created for both Charlotte and Eric, now they can expect to receive welcome emails from Formula 5, and also they will have access granted to specific resources like Microsoft Teams channels. How can we achieve something like this? With Microsoft Entra ID governance lifecycle workflows. So under ID governance in Entra Admin Center, there is Lifecycle Workflows tab. And important fact is that specific Entra ID governance license is required to access this feature. So now, once I have license assigned, I can create workflow. So when I click Create Workflow, I will have access to predefined templates, but obviously I can customize my workflow. So in this case, as you can see, there is onboard pre-hire employee template, onboard new hire template. So we use this one. So when I select this, let me click it. As you can see, the trigger is time-based trigger, and the event user attribute is employee hire date. That's why I was mentioning that employee hire date is crucial when we import the data from BambooHR, because we use this attribute from BambooHR to trigger specific lifecycle workflow. And obviously, under tasks, we can define different tasks that will be executed. So we can, for instance, enable user account in Microsoft Entra ID. We can send welcome email. We can add users to specific groups and Microsoft Teams channels, and so on and so forth. So in this specific scenario, we use lifecycle workflows to send welcome emails and grant access to specific resources for the new employees. Great, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting and helpful. If you have any questions, you can contact me directly. Here is my email address. And I hope to see you in the next videos. Thank you so much for watching.